Hello, and welcome to Workplace Stories, the podcast where human capital experts share their real-world experiences and insights. Hosted by Red Thread Research, Workplace Stories surfaces the latest industry trends, innovative talent strategies, and best practices for success. Tune in for practical advice on how to best transform your workplace.
Welcome to Workplace Stories. Today, I had the opportunity to talk to Al D., who's the founder of Edge of Work, which is a leadership and talent consulting firm. And he's also the host of a podcast by the same name called Edge of Work Podcast. I've known Al for quite a while. He is one of those people that always makes me think differently about something. And so when I have a big idea or when I'm thinking of new research, I often have a quick conversation with Al to see what he's doing and how he's thinking about this thing. The conversation that we had was both philosophical and practical. We talked about some of the bigger questions. What's L&D's role in business? Are we thinking big enough about the future, etc.? But we also got into real life, real world L&D challenges that leaders are facing. Some of the things that we covered included why L&D keeps fighting for a seat at the table, in quotes, and why that might be the wrong conversation. We also talked about the shift of L&D from a support function to a problem solver function. We talked about skills and the push for skills organizations and what's working and what's not. And we also talked about why L&D leaders need to stop doing certain things if they want to stay relevant in the next 5 years. It was a fascinating conversation. It was big and meaty. There's a lot of stuff in there. But it's also really fun to listen to. Al is just a really engaging person. If you like this podcast, please follow us on the platform of your choice and visit us at redthreadresearch.com to learn a little bit more about our research and some of the other things that we do. Welcome to Workplace Stories, Al.
Hey, Danny. It's great to be here with you.
It's really good to have you here. Just to get started, I want to maybe give people a sense for what you do for a living. Your job is maybe a little bit different than some of our audience. So please describe to me your work.
Great question. I am the founder of the Edge of Work, which is a talent and leadership consulting firm. So I spend a lot of my days working with organizations to develop their leaders to better drive performance and productivity inside of organizations. And that ranges from anything from traditional leadership development to career development to individual coaching. But in addition to all of that work, I also host the podcast, The Edge of Work, where Danny has been a guest on the show. And so as a result of that and just being out in the world quite a bit, I spend a lot of time talking with talent and learning leaders inside of organizations to better understand what their priorities are, what they're focused on, what keeps them up at night, and what they're excited about.
I think this is one of the reasons that I love having conversations with you, because we both see inside so many different organizations. And yeah, it makes the conversations really interesting. Okay, this next question is something that we ask everyone, but I don't think I warned you about. And this is your opportunity just to brag a little bit. I want to know why we should listen to you on this topic.
I had a feeling you were going to ask this question. A longtime listener, first-time caller to the Workplace Stories podcast. So
very good.
Big fan. My review is somewhere there in Apple. To answer your question, why should people listen to me? So I try to the best that I can live my life by one model in particular, which is this idea of confident humility. And the idea behind confident humility is that in any given situation, I show up having done my homework for what I know and what I think I have strengths and expertise in. And so anytime I have a conversation with anyone, I feel pretty confident in saying that I will come prepared. And in my areas of expertise, I will share that expertise. And I have confidence in that. Humility in that, in addition to thinking that I'm humble, based off what I know about learning, I know that I can always learn. And that there are a lot of things that I do not know and that I'm open to learning. And I also just don't take myself too seriously. I try to live by the model of take your work seriously without taking yourself too seriously. And so when I talk, hopefully I will be able to share some things with you that you can have confidence that I'm sharing from my own knowledge and expertise and what I've learned, but also that I have so much work that I am doing as well and on this journey and learning. And I just try to keep that openness to everything that I do.
I love that. And I'm going to maybe challenge it a little bit because I know that you recently became a father. And that was a new thing to me not so long ago as well. And I realized that I know nothing. Like literally, I know nothing.
Yeah. Talk about something that definitely reminds you of just how much you have to learn. Yes, it's a very humbling and rewarding gift.
Yeah. How's it going?
It's good. He's wonderful. Thanks for asking. He's 6 weeks old. He is a lot of work in all of the best ways. And I'm sure we can talk more about this, but at the end of the day, particularly for the work that I do, I have so much empathy for anyone who has ever had to take on a new role, been through a big change, or had to do a bunch of things that they didn't ever have to do before. because that's what these past 6 weeks have felt like. I feel very lucky. I have a great partner and also a great support staff of people and just friends willing to cheer me on. Yes, it's very rewarding, but also very humbling.
All right. So for the last little while, I've been having this sort of public conversation about L&D and their role in the world. L&D teams often talk about wanting to have more influence and more impact. We know this, but the reality is that a lot of organizations just see them as a support function. And that could be a good thing or a bad thing. We've argued both sides of that. But I'm really curious, maybe if we start with that context, what are the most meaningful shifts that you see happening in the way that organizations are thinking about learning?
It's a great question. And I'll preface this by saying that I wish there were more, but let me try to share a couple that I'm seeing and see where this lands with you. So I think the first thing I would say is that I just don't know a company or an industry where that is not undergoing some kind of industry shift, change, transformation, et cetera. If you are, please tell us how, teach us your ways. But I think that's just the reality. And so one thing I am seeing is that when a company now has decided to actually make the transformation a strategic priority of the company, I have seen some really good examples where learning has been identified as being a key enabler of that transformation. And as a result of that, perhaps getting the quote unquote proverbial seat at the table because they understand that for whatever business transformation they're undergoing, there's a learning piece that is critical to it. And so there has definitely been a lot of that I have been seeing, and a number of really good examples where people in senior leadership roles in learning and talent have been able to really, I would say, maybe do more than they would have because of the fact of that transformation and change. I think the second thing that I've seen, and this is more industry specific, and this goes within tech, but there are some tech companies, and you probably know some of them as I do, who learning is actually critical to their business model because of the nature of the product services that they have. Previously, I worked at Salesforce. A lot of people may know this, but learning is really important at Salesforce because they need their customers to adopt their products. And one of the ways they do that is learning. And so I've seen some really interesting shifts in terms of how they think about learning in those organizations, from anything ranging from how the organization structures learning to how it links both internal learning and external learning with customers. There was just an announcement. I don't know if you saw this, you may have seen it. ServiceNow basically just announced some external learning initiatives that they're running. There are some Salesforce alum who are now at ServiceNow, so it's not surprising. But that is something where, again, the business model necessitates learning. The third thing I would say is I do see this a little bit, and particularly through all the org shifts that have been happening. And it's this idea of looking at talent as a system versus looking at talent as a function, right? Tapaswi Chandel, who you just had on, I just listened to that episode, wonderful episode. Her kind of, I don't know if she said this explicitly, but to me, if she didn't say, she's a systems thinker, I can just tell. And you can tell by how she thinks about her organization and her people and how they think about talent. I know that Johnson & Johnson for a long time has really thought about their HR function in this kind of way. And it's no surprise that their outgoing CHRO, Peter Fasolo, who just retired, he was a CHRO for 17 years. So he clearly was doing something right. But really trying to more embed tightly how you run things across the entire life cycle of HR or the employee experience. And learning sits with that. And then the last thing I would just add is just AI. And definitely in some organizations, this one's, I think, a little bit easier to understand of, hey, we've got to figure out this AI thing. It's probably going to involve learning in some kind of capacity, and learning could have a chance to step up. So those are, I think, maybe 4 I'm seeing. I don't know if those land at all for you. And again, I would say maybe I would love to see more of it, but I do see some bright spots out there.
So one of the things that I think was interesting about the things that you said is they're mostly external forces that are helping learning become a thing. You know what I mean? So that proverbial seat at the table or whatever, at Salesforce, it's already a thing. At Coke, where Tapaswi is, it's already a thing. They've already decided that this is how they do the thing. And that's awesome. I think that's how it should be. What should L&D functions do if they don't have that kind of external support to be there? You know what I mean?
It's a good question. It's a good call out. I don't have an answer for this, but there's part of me that wonders if that is the gateway in. Because at the end of the day, companies only exist when they have customers. And to a certain degree, it almost does have to at least indirectly come from an external force of some kind, because an organization wouldn't exist if it didn't have customers. To a certain degree, I think some of this has to be grounded. But even in some of the examples I gave, I talked with someone recently, who I think you probably know, who they're in the energy industry or oil and gas industry, where the learning really hasn't, in their specific space, it really hasn't had that seat at the table ever. Yes, there were definitely in this case, there were some market shifts. But one of the interesting things in this scenario I'm thinking about when I was talking to the individual, they were telling me that it wasn't as if the company didn't even value learning or want them to be there, Like what they found was that they just weren't liking what they were getting. And so it just took coming with an outside voice, being open and being humble and like really seeking to understand. And that is what eventually helped them, at least to begin with, have a really good mandate to do some things. But like to trying to workshop with you out loud, just really thinking for the folks out there who want that but aren't getting it. For me, at least, it always starts with two things. Number one, like what are the problems to be solved or the jobs to be done? And this is true for any function or any role that's trying to get more airtime, if you will. And just like really making sure that we are trying to solve business problems and not just learning problems. I think it's very easy to conflate the two sometimes, but I ask any leader if they have any problems that need solving, and they will very much tell you that, yes, there are some. And to really anchor on understanding what that problem is, without even thinking about what the intervention is, what the learning thing is, whatever, just like, what is the actual business problem? But then I think the other thing, and this is something I think we all tend to overlook, and I think Skills is putting it back into light, what is the work that actually needs to get done? I think we collectively, not just L&D, but I think we've taken our eye off the ball on that a little bit. And I think it's really easy as to why. We all have gotten so good at being efficient with our tasks and what we need to do and need to do on the to-do list and the deliverables we need to create and do this or that. And we forget, well, what are we actually doing this for? And so I think the combination of what are actual business problems that need to be solved and like what is like work that needs to like actually be done and getting clear on those things, I think are really good grounding points. Because what that will do is that will give you or give your leaders who you're trying to get the seat at the table with the confidence that you have the context that is needed to actually go and solve those problems. And I think that would, for me at least, would be the starting point. Yeah.
So I think two things that I completely agree with that you mentioned. The first was focus on the business results. Like we've been saying that for what, like 50, 60 years?
Yeah, I know. I feel bad saying it because we've been saying it for so long.
But it is very true. Like a lot of organizations are like, let's think about learning culture and the experiences, the quote unquote learner and all that. And that is good. That is part of your job for sure. But the way that you build credibility in an organization is not that. The way you build credibility is be like, oh, CEO, you have this problem. Let me solve that problem for you. That's what we should be doing. So that's the first thing. And the second thing that you mentioned is this idea of skills. As you know, we've been deep in skills forever. And one of the things that we've come to is it's actually skills data, not like high level skills. It's the data. And the thing that's interesting about that is that it is a common language across everything. So we talked a little bit earlier about a lot of these functions are starting to come together and the common language across them as well as the organization is tasks and skills. These are the things we need done. Here are the people that can do them. Doesn't matter what we call it. That's super interesting. Okay, so now talk to me a little bit about like the future. So we've talked about like the now, how do we solve this problem right now? But what do you think L&D organizations that truly are impactful in the future are going to be doing?
This is a good question. I feel like you've done more research on this than I have. I want to give a couple examples and then actually maybe pivot the question a little bit to talk a little bit more about what might an L&D practitioner who is thinking about that maybe need to think differently about. So I want to give two anecdotal examples and see where this lands for you. So I recently talked with someone who is a friend of mine. They are a director of employee engagement and learning and development at probably like a 1,500 person organization. And so when they were in the hiring process for the role, originally, the role was for director of learning and development. And they actually pushed back and said, hey, I'm only going to take this role if I can get employee engagement as well. If you don't even want to put in the title, that's fine. But the reason why they did that is because it was going to give them ownership of the employee engagement survey. And they wanted to make sure that for the work they were going to be able to do, that they were going to have a baseline and a basis and something, some kind of record to be able to show the results that they were going to be able to generate. And so I think that speaks to two things that come out of it. I think one, I mean, it's a smaller company, so naturally I think learning is going to be tightly closer aligned with maybe something else because of you just don't have enough hands at that point where you can specialize. But I think the other thing that it really speaks to is that data piece. And in this case, it was employee engagement data, but I think in general, it could be any kind of data. I think they're going to get closer to the data in some kind of capacity because we're going to need to show impact. But the other thing that's going to happen is that when more AI comes along, which it probably will, as you pointed out with skills, that's essential part of what the AI is after and what the valuable part of AI is the data. And whether it's going to be grabbing that data and making sense of that data, taking that data and getting an agent to go do whatever you need to do, I think there's going to need to be much more data literacy and understanding of data or an alignment with data than perhaps in the past. And then the other thing I would just say, and I think this has come up in a couple of your conversations, particularly at larger companies, you have a model for how you design the learning team or whatnot, but like this like learning business partner model or learning partner like model where either different functions or different business units get a learning partner, I think particularly once you get to organizations of certain sizes, it's like the only thing that you can do to like keep up with the scale that you have to support. So I would say those are two things that come to mind, but like, I think it's actually worth a conversation. I don't have an answer for this yet. I'm talking out loud. I know the shifts in the org and the org design are important, but what does it actually mean for the people who are here? What will your job look like in 3 years and 5 years? I think that's a worthwhile question to be asking ourselves, right? Because I know for a fact, I know you guys are on the conference circuit, so am I. These are the kinds of questions every other function or industry or role are asking themselves. And I think it's a worthwhile exercise that we should be asking ourselves too. I have a good feeling that if we're doing the same things today, or in 3 years that we're doing today, we're probably not going to be in the right place. But I think it is a good invitation to really ask ourselves as we do think about the future, like, where do we need to go? And my starting point for this is that it's got to look different than what it is.
Yeah, which is interesting because, as you mentioned, we speak at a lot of conferences, and a lot of times I hear, oh yeah, AI is going to be great for L&D because now we can do things faster, right? Like we can design this thing faster, when in actuality, maybe we should be thinking about the things that we're not doing today that we could do now that we do have AI. Yeah, I was in a skills huddle this week. Our members get together once a month and talk about skills, and Mitchell McNair, I think he's a great thinker. And one of the things that he said is, we're not looking for incremental change here. We're looking for step change. It is like, we can't afford to keep on like optimizing. We actually need to like step out of what we're doing and get to the next level in all of this stuff.
I agree. That is often my piece of perspective and offering I give to people, is that I don't know if we're thinking big enough yet about what it could possibly be. And to a certain degree, like, it's easy for me to say that, but I also think it's true. And even just like anecdotally, so I actually did, maybe about 3 months ago, I did a LinkedIn poll, not the most scientific thing out there, but better than
nothing. Yeah.
Better than nothing. And I asked people, I said, what do you think will be, or where do you think the biggest benefit of AI will be? And I gave like a couple of like speed, scale, I forget what a couple of the other things were, but essentially to the effect of like, where do you think AI will help you the most? And like, basically what it amounted to was like, most people thought and wanted AI to help them do things faster. And I said, you know what, like, again, like, there's nothing wrong with that. There's a time and a place for that. But maybe to Mitchell's point, that is an incremental change, when I do think we should be looking for something much, much bigger. And not to mention, like, there's no shortage of problems that exist in organizations that aren't transformational in size. It's not like we have to, if we really wanted to solve this, like, we'd have to look for them and be like, hey, like, anyone have any like bigger problems that they've come across lately? It's like, yeah, like 20. So anyway, I'm definitely on the bandwagon of we need to think bigger.
So I'm totally on board with thinking bigger about things, both from the L&D standpoint and from a larger organizational standpoint. Do you think that there are things that we fundamentally need to rethink in L&D as we do that?
Yeah, it's a good question. I guess first and foremost, as a starting point, and I think this, I would say everyone should do it, but it really should start at the leadership level. And I was thinking about this because I was listening to a podcast the other day. If you think about strategy, right? Strategy is about choice, right? And making choices. And I think at the highest of levels, I think we need to make some choices at the highest of levels of what problems do we actually want to go and solve. And I think that's important because I think we've gotten really good sometimes at confusing actually providing like remedies with like actually like addressing what problems are. And so I think as a grounding point at the highest of levels, all of us could do this, is like really starting to make choices about, if we're the VP of learning or head of learning, like, what are the actual problems that we want to solve that will deliver impact for the business? And like really having a line in the sand of what that is. And I think that's important because in addition to the whole idea about having a seat at the table and the whole like being a strategic partner versus order taker, people who have a seat at the table have a differentiated point of view that they can stand on. It's not just about being a partner. Like, you actually need, I think, in my opinion, need to have a point of view about why you're even there and what you're even going to do. Going back from there, I think one of the things that I often wonder sometimes is that for those of us who are here listening today, and like for, I think, Danny, you and me, I can very much assume that like we're a little bit excited about the idea of going to learn something at work, right? Because it's like, oh, like I learned something new, or like, oh, this is really useful, or like, oh, I didn't know that. Like, that's really great. I think the second question we should ask ourselves, are we the exception in our company, or are we the norm? And my hunch is that depending on where you work and depending on how large your organization is, more often than not, we are the exception, not necessarily the norm. And it's not that other people don't like to learn. It's not that they have anything against learning. It's that I think a lot of people go to work because they have a job to do and want to do that job. And like, yeah, if they learn something, that's great. And so when you're getting back to your question of like, is there something we need to maybe rethink? I do think we need to ask ourselves sometimes, going back to what's the role of like learning and what fundamental assumptions, like what are our people here to do? And there will be some people like you and me for sure, but I don't think that will be in many organizations be the norm. It will be the exception. So I think that would be one place for where to maybe start.
This is really interesting because for the last, I don't know, year and a half, like my assumption has been that the L&D's functions job is to ensure a skilled workforce. That's what they're there for. If they can't do that, then why exist? You know what I mean? And when I say this to almost any L&D person that I've talked to, they're like, yeah, that's right. But I don't know that we give that enough credence. What actually does that mean? How do we find out the skills that they need? What should we be focusing on? I think a lot of times the efforts of L&D folks is putting out fires and doing what other people think they should be doing rather than having time to actually think strategically.
I think you're right. And I think what that to me amounts to at least is that when you really do have that North Star or differentiated point of view and you feel confident in it, I'm not saying it's easy to ignore the fires or to tell people no, but when you have more conviction in what you believe, I think it is a lot easier to say, hey, that's really interesting, but here's what we're here to do. And so we can have a separate conversation about that, but that doesn't fall in our remit, or like, that's not really what we're about. When it's a little bit more flimsy, or maybe when it's not truly articulated, I think that's when it becomes, okay, yeah, we can take that on and we can take this on. And so I think there is a little bit more of like, honestly, just devil in the details that maybe we need to do to be like true to making sure that, yeah, if we really actually believe this, here is the evidence in terms of the projects that we've taken on, the metrics that we've signed up for, and the measures that will tell us if we are tracking in the right direction to know that like our actual like strategy like actually maps to like what we're doing. And if it's not, let's have an honest conversation about it and try to get back on track. I'm oversimplifying it, but I think directionally, I think that's where we probably need to head.
So have a stronger strategy and stick to it, basically.
I think that's part of it. I think maybe another thing to add into this is that I think we do, while I do think we need to rethink some fundamental assumptions, we do know a lot about human behavior and it's relatively stayed the same. We are learning some new things like about neuroscience and stuff like that, but like we know a lot about humans and like we also know a lot about learning. Some of those foundational aspects of learning are still pretty true, right? Spaced repetition matters, like social learning, like matters. Like I say that like we do need to rethink these fundamental assumptions, but also at the same time, I know I'm like talking about both sides of my mouth, like we still should hold true to perhaps like what we know to be true about some of the things in our field that make a difference. I think the rub is that if everything is working for you, then you can ignore what I said. But if it's not working, well, then the question becomes, all right, like, how do I stay true to maybe some of those principles, but maybe think differently about how they get applied? Because if I'm not getting the result that I want, what is the Einstein quote? The definition of insanity is doing the same thing over and over again and expecting a different result. And so maybe that's a good place for some reflection and thought.
Yeah, that's interesting. When we were doing our L&D strategy work later last year, we talked to a whole bunch of leaders about what they thought about L&D strategy and what they were doubling down on, specifically when it comes to skills in L&D. And a lot of them said instructional design. And I was really surprised given like the way the world is and stuff. But if you think about it, L&D is unique in their ability to do many of those things. And they're unique. Like most of the organization doesn't understand any of that stuff. You know what I mean? So if you're trying to like upskill a workforce or move everybody in the same direction, having those skills is helpful. And I think they're undervalued quite a bit. And as you mentioned, they might be misapplied in instances for sure. It was surprising to me that they saw that as a very important part of their strategy and making sure that the L&D function had that knowledge.
And going back to one of the things I mentioned earlier, it's like, again, strategy is about choices. And so it's like, if that's the choice you want to make and there's intention and rationale behind it, then who am I to tell you what to do? Everyone's context is going to be different. And I think you mentioned this example to me. And I think the thing that sticks out to me is that look, like in their world, like maybe there is something to when everyone's zigging, like you're zagging, or to have a differentiated skill set could actually really matter in that kind of circumstance. So yeah, like without knowing the full context, I could see a world where that actually might be something that is helpful based off of the strategy that they're trying to build.
Yeah, interesting. Talk to me about positioning L&D within the larger organization. Oftentimes I see L&D folks as whiners. I don't have a seat at the table. But there are some serious reasons why they might not have a seat at the table, and there might be some mindset. So structurally and mindset-wise, how do you think L&D leaders should position their organizations to have more of an impact on that organization?
It's a good question. So the first thing I will say, this does not let us off the hook, but I have in my career have had the privilege of not just working in HR and L&D, but also working with marketing and IT and a couple other functions. And so I offer this up in terms of saying the seat at the table conversation is not just an L&D thing. I think this happens a lot in organizations that maybe are not sales or engineering, where you're in an enabling function when it comes to outcomes and outputs. And so I offer that up so that if you are feeling like this conversation is getting old, know that it's happening in other places and you're not alone. And I do think we need to do something about it, really think more about this. It's funny. One of your analyst colleagues in the industry posted something the other day talking about how they've been spending a lot of time talking with a number of business leaders who are like, I really need help with skills. They're back to them well, have you talked to your HR and L&D teams? And they're like, but the impetus of it was sometimes we tend to think, no one wants to work with us or do these things. And the point that they were making was that in those specific instances, and probably many of us, others of us are guilty of this, we need to go out and walk the walls and really understand what's going on in the rest of the organization. And again, I know that sounds simple and I feel bad for saying it, but if we were doing it more often, then this wouldn't be a thing and our colleague would not have posted what they posted because they did. And I think for me, part of this stems, I started my career in management consulting, which meant in the 7 years I had 30 different clients. I was constantly, if I wanted to be successful and I wanted to be taken seriously, I had to go out of my way to really understand their context, their workflow, their culture in a very short amount of time. And so this to me comes naturally, but I recognize it doesn't for everyone. Another one of our colleagues in the industry mentioned that as a leader, if they were not spending at least 50% of their time talking with other business leaders or other people in the organization, then they knew that they were being too insulated. And so I think part of how do we get more involved is actually getting more involved. None of the things that we're trying to do exist in a vacuum. All of us work in an organization that is far bigger than just learning or any other function for that matter. And so if you want to find the answers to the problems that you can solve and to be a part of the conversation, I would start by going out and having those conversations and just taking the step to actually do that. In terms of positioning L&D, in terms of what we can do, I mean, there's a certain amount of that that's going to be subjective and is going to vary by organization. I do think other people have said this, and I'll piggyback on top of it. But number one, I do think it helps to really lean into a little bit more of that consultative skill set, a little bit stronger. I think Dave Ulrich has talked about this. Josh Bershon has talked about this in terms of that approach and that mindset, that combination both of stakeholder management as well as business acumen and problem solving, I think is really important. But the other thing that often gets talked about here a lot of times, in addition to that, I think that's an element of it is actually being attuned and aware to what's going on. And then I would say just the last thing is that I think a good place to start, honestly, is with your own, yes, you're a function or maybe you're supporting a function, but your other colleagues in HR can be often a good place to start too, because there are actually, honestly, many of them, particularly some of the more specialized COEs, probably are trying to do some of the similar things that we are in terms of trying to get more support. But others have complementary skill sets. I think you and Stacia are actually a really good example of this, of people analytics and L&D. If they could team up a little bit, they could actually do a lot of really positive things together. And so it's just even just being more aware of, hey, yes, business leaders matter and functions matter, but even when in HR, there's some good we can do about being more tightly aligned on some of the core kinds of experiences or workflows or processes or things that we run. Because at the end of the day, one of the best ways to increase your impact is to be able to get other people to go out on the journey with you. And so even sometimes starting within HR can actually be a good place to start.
I love it. We're going to take a short break and maybe talk about some of the lighter things. We call it our lightning round. I have 3 questions for you and just answer them briefly to tell us a little bit more about you. So the first one is, what day in your life would you like to relive?
This was maybe December 15th of my senior year of high school. It was right near the Christmas holiday. I know this because I went to a Catholic high school and we always had a Christmas mass before the holiday. The short of it is that it snowed that day. It snowed during mass. So after we got out of mass, there was a huge mess in the parking lot because there was buses, there was cars. It was a mess. No one knew what to do. And so naturally, because this is just, I guess, how I'm wired, I got out there, helped the buses get through, helped people directed traffic, and everything went on their merry way. And it was just typical for me, just how I think, how I operate. But then when I got home, I went to the mailbox and opened up the mailbox, and there was a big white envelope, and it was my acceptance letter to Boston College, where I was at school. It was just one of those days where it's just like, okay, not that like just because you do something good, like something good's going to happen to you, but it was more along the lines of that story. I think in a lot of ways for people that know me, like that just explains a little bit of just how I'm wired and how I am. But I'll obviously remember the BC part, but like I do remember that story about directing parking lot traffic at my high school when no one else could figure it out, because like I'd like to think on a good day that story embodies me pretty well.
I love that. I think it's always interesting how people answer that question, because they either do like you, that was such a great day, or they're like, I hated this day, I wanted to do it again. It's just a different way. I'm glad you chose the positive. What about what job do you think you'd be good at, not counting the one you have?
I'm going to cheat a little bit on this. My first job and one of my favorite jobs was being a caddy at a golf course. I grew up playing golf, and one of the ways you could play for free was if you caddied. And so I caddied at this country club. It was a great job. Made money, helped me come out of my shell, built really good social skills, all the like this, that, and the other. But I enjoyed it so much, even sometimes more than playing it. But yeah, if this goes well and I can retire soon, I might go back to caddying.
You know what's really interesting is my husband and I were at lunch one day and there was golf playing on wherever we were. I was like, I wonder how much caddies make. So I looked it up and we did the research to see how much they can make a decent amount of money, like $500,000 a year if they're like caddying for whoever, because they get a cut of the winnings and all that stuff. But it was also a lot more complicated job than I originally anticipated. There's a lot of knowledge and stuff that goes into that.
Yeah, for sure. Absolutely.
Awesome. I can totally see you being a caddy.
Thank you.
Last question. What is the best thing that happened to you last week?
So Danny knows this for the listeners out there who don't, but my wife and I just had our first child. We've got a son, Theo, who's 6 weeks old. We were giving him a bath this week, and he's had a couple baths and he hates them. But we started washing his hair and something just flipped for him. And he went from like wailing at the top of his lungs to being like dead silent. It was like he just learned how awesome like having warm water on your hair was. And like he can't smile yet or do anything. But like in my head, it was like, oh, he just learned that this thing is like something that he likes. And so it just was like, A, it was a relief that like he wasn't screaming the rest of the time. But B, it was like, oh, this is cool that he's like learning that a bath isn't that bad after all. But it was, yeah, this is just one of those moments. I'm sure there are other parents who have had some version of that. Yeah, that was a really good one.
That's a good story. All right. I want to maybe shift the conversation to more skills, less L&D, more skills.
Okay.
There's been a huge push towards skills in skills-based hiring, skills-based organizations, internal talent marketplaces, talent mobility. It feels like it's sort of infiltrating everything. And as I mentioned before, we've been studying this for like ever, five or 6 years. We've got a lot of research on it, but the progress has been mixed. And I have some ideas about why that progress has been mixed, but I'd love your thoughts on that as well. So first question is, how are organizations making progress towards being skilled space, particularly in their workforce? And what obstacles do you think they're running into?
Oh, man. So in terms of on the making progress side, and it's funny, I was actually going back through my notes as well as listening to a couple of your episodes and a couple other episodes of different skills journeys. So I'll say a couple things. From a leadership perspective, there's a couple things that I think leaders who are leading these initiatives do well that enables the success. Number one, from just like if you want to call it attributes or capabilities, is systems thinking. They look at this as a systems problem that has interconnected and interrelated parts. And also that, particularly in systems thinking type problems, they're often complex and not complicated, which means that there isn't always a clear solution. And that the only way to get to it is to explore, test, and see the different possibilities and be comfortable that the first thing you do might not work out, but you have to try again. And so I think people that approach this with a systems thinking mindset put themselves in a little bit better of a chance to succeed, if only because what at least I've seen, and I don't know if you've seen this too, most of the companies that are on this journey tend to be on the mid-size to larger side, where an organization of that size is just going to be complex anyway. I think the second thing is that it's their orientation around change. I think what most of the people who've done it well have realized that change management, it's a mindset and it's also a muscle, right? A mindset in that you're kind of in the business of change now at all times. Like change management isn't just a couple rows on an Excel spreadsheet of things that you have to do. It's like kind of an always on thing. And as a result of that, it's also a muscle in the sense of a muscle gets stronger the more that you actively use it. They are able to recognize that for the stakeholders that they bring along board, that each of those people was at a different stage of like where they are on the journey. And they really take the time to meet them where they are and bring them on the journey with them. And I think that leads to the third thing, which is this is a huge exercise in stakeholder management to like squared or like quad to the fourth degree or whatever it is. And they're just able to like take that in stride. I think that some of these initiatives, and I think you've probably seen this too, they can get really hairy really quickly. And because so much of this is also wrapped up in behavior change and changing the way that things work, in a lot of cases, decades of working in a certain way, it's very easy to ask a question and then learn a whole bunch of things that are all of a sudden going to make whatever you're doing way more complicated. But the people who seem to be making progress are comfortable navigating through that. And look, like, it's not necessarily an easy thing, but they also understand that, again, going back to the systems thing, that these little intricacies matter. And in the end, whatever they're producing or how they're making progress, it might be simple to the end user because it has to be, so it makes sense. But for anything that is simple, if you actually look behind it in terms of work that has to get done, it's far more complex, and they're just able to sit with that. So just from a leadership perspective, I think those are a couple things, and I'll stop there. We can get more into some of the more tactical things, but like those are a couple of the observations, at least I've had from my conversations and what I've been seeing.
Yeah, and we would agree with you if Stacia were here. She's here in spirit, but we would totally agree with you. Systemic thinking, Stacia and I, we almost always think system rather than person because it seems easier to us. And it's a bigger challenge. Like if you can get the systems right in organizations, then the people that move through those systems it's easier to do it. In the case of skills, it's interesting though, because you can get all your sort of technical systems and you can get a lot of even your people systems right. But the way that you communicate about skills, the way that you define yourself as a human, all of these things are wrapped up in a pretty traditional way of thinking. And so I think that culture piece is just crucial.
Yeah. And on that, I was just talking with someone else the other day. There's actually, I don't know if you've seen this, but like for some reason, like I've been talking to a lot of people who work in like pharma or life sciences who are going on the skills journey to varying degrees. And one of the things that stuck out to me about them was that they have a 5-person team that is essentially working on skills. It's within HR, but like it's an agile team. They have complementary skill sets. They use principles of product management in agile, and they have releases. And so what it made me think about though, they've had some really good progress. What it made me think about though is that because I should also add for context, the organization itself doesn't have a lot of agile. I think you almost need to work in new ways for how you deliver what you're doing. What you're doing that you're delivering is also going to be new. Because I think the traditional ways in which you approach this, because it is so much of the old, it's going to be very easy, or it could get very derailed really quickly by just using that traditional kind of approach. So I was just going to say that as one thing, and I'm not necessarily advocating for agile or product management, but like I do think elements of are important for this, which is around like developing a core hypothesis, having small kind of releases where you get feedback, measuring. Like I think those things really matter. And also for that matter, particularly from a tech perspective, not all HR organizations have done that in the past. And so there's a certain capability that comes with that. But the other thing I was going to say, and I noticed this when I was looking through my notes about looking at a couple of organizations who've been on this journey. Number one, a bunch of times it really has started with a bigger transformation in the company. I was listening to the story about AstraZeneca and some of the work that they have done around skills. That started from the CEO and the exec team basically having like a bake-off of, we're going to fund like 5 transformation projects, and like 20 teams like applied, and like L&D applied for something around skills. And that got them started in 2019. This is 2025. They're still going. So number one, like there was a burning platform. But the other thing I was going to say to this is that it is a little bit of a journey. Again, we're in 2025. They started in 2019. Like they're still going. And so that was the other thing that I picked up on. And this makes sense, right? If you're farther along, clearly that means you've been doing this for more time. Most of the time, if you are farther along, it generally means you've had a little bit more time to do this longer. And I also think that was another thing that I noticed about some of the other companies I've been looking at that are on these journeys is that like they have gotten either the air cover or the investment to be able to have some runway. It doesn't mean that like they can work slow. It just means that there was an acknowledgement by senior leadership or a stakeholder that this was not going to be just a simple, hey, take some assessments. We're going to spit something out about how many skills that you have. If someone either built in that understanding and set expectations properly, or there was an acknowledgement by the people who were funding it and supporting it that, yeah, like I understand that this isn't a quick fix, that it's a longer term systemic way of thinking and operating.
Yeah, which is really interesting because right now there seems to be a big push to show ROI, and skills, we're not to the point where we can do that. And so those organizations that are dipping in, it reminds me of the conversation we had with MetLife, which is one of our most listened to episodes. But I remember talking to them and them saying very clearly that we're doing this because this is what's next. This will get us to whatever it is that we're doing next. It's not because we can show an ROI in the next year and a half. And I think one of the things that's particularly interesting about what you said is that skills is a journey and it's taking us past the systems and processes that we currently have. And so to use the systems and processes that we currently have to create it keeps us stuck. So I see a lot of organizations, for example, go, yeah, let's take skills, let's align them to our org chart. You know what I mean? Which is not a bad place to start, but we're aligning it to our org chart and it turns into the 90s capabilities and competencies mess. You know what I mean? It's just a more complicated version of that. When organizations can think, oh my gosh, if we can get skills data on these people, then we can do all these different things. First of all, mind's open and you can start seeing different ways that this can be done in the future. But it also, I think, provides a little bit more tolerance for some of those step changes that need to happen in order for it to happen. If that makes sense.
I agree with you. And I know the term mindset can sometimes go into a really fluffy place, but I do think there's a certain amount of that needs to happen. And I do think to a certain degree, if you think about what people are trying to ultimately do with skills, like it really is a new way of thinking about talent and what you believe of talent. And there's two Einstein quotes that I live by for this kind of work. The first is that you can't use an old map to explore a new world. And then the second is that you cannot solve the problems of today with the same thinking that got us here. And I think if you hold those two close to you, if you're on this journey, hopefully that will be enough for you to shift your own mindset about, hey, are we thinking big enough? Hey, are we thinking differently enough? I find that those things are helpful for me, at least.
Yeah, for sure. And it's also been a little bit complicated in the last, since Gen AI made its debut in a big way, it is becoming even more complicated because instead of just talking about the skills that we need for roles, we're also talking about the tasks within those roles that we can now outsource. And what does that mean for the person who's currently in that role? And what does that mean for the organization needing to redesign all of the roles to take advantage of the people versus the things that we can now get off our plates? So skills, if we continue to think of skills like they're just competencies, only more granular, we miss out on huge opportunities to completely redesign the work, not just for efficiency, but to really tap into the talents and the skills that people have.
And I think you sort of maybe outline a little bit of the nuance and the challenge between that transformational ROI and the speed to impact. It's almost as if I think there was a world where you can thread the needle, but it's very easy to see that as a reductionist argument of we need to prove value fast. So let's just do the thing that shows people the value. Whereas I'm not saying every time you want to think and work in a new way that like it has to take 10 years to do it. But if we're truly taking that at face value, it does take a little thinking and working in a new way doesn't happen necessarily overnight. But if we are able to hold space, maybe that is where the transformational ROI can come. And I guess maybe to put this in a bow a little bit, I think maybe that's what, in your example of like MetLife or some of the others, what they've realized is that, yes, this may hurt from a quarterly earnings perspective and like someone's going to have to manage that expectation. And we expect to be a 100 to 200, 300 year business. And we know that this will help us actually get towards whatever that is. And so we're going to be able to stomach that. But like, I'm not a CEO of a Fortune 500 company, but I can appreciate that that might be something of a really tough bridge to maybe for some people to want to cross.
And we're going to leave the conversation right there because we have to wrap up. Two final questions for you, Al. Actually, just one final question for you. And this is a question we ask everybody. First time I answered it, I like broke into tears. So just be prepared. And that is, why do you do the work that you do?
At various points in my life, I believe that there are people who nudged, coached, encouraged, prodded me because they saw something in me that maybe I couldn't see in myself. And so I believed in the power of people and like the abilities within people. And so that's what motivates me to do the work that I do each and every day. But I also have learned that I've actually gained that ability to do that for others. And so I'm not going to be here forever, but for as long as I'm here, if I could try to do that a little bit each day, like to me, that would be a well-lived life. And so that's what keeps me motivated to do the work that I do.
Good answer. Thanks for being with us today, Al.
Thank you. It's a pleasure.
Okay, that's a wrap for this episode of Workplace Stories. If you like what you heard, please subscribe to our podcast so that you can be the first to know about future episodes. For exclusive access to our research, insights, and a vibrant network of human capital leaders, consider joining the Red Thread Research community. Visit redthreadresearch.com to learn more and to take your workplace to the next level.